Step forward. Robert and Charlotte Brett are suing their former friend and roommate, Taylor Nichols, for breaking their lease.
Mr. and Mrs. Brett, before you were married, while you were sort of testing out the waters, the two of you lived together in an apartment with the defendant. The three of you were on the lease. I assume you knew each other before and were friends. And there came a time when the defendant got himself into some trouble and he had to move home in order to, I gather from your complaint, stay out of jail. He was given a choice of being on probation, living under some house rules. So he left the apartment and went back pursuant to a court order to live at home. Is that right? That's what you tell me.
Yes, ma'am.
In here. That happened over a year ago. Well, since that time, you and your then girlfriend, now wife, got married. You had a baby. And you want him to pay the fees that you paid for breaking the lease, because you say that because he moved out, you could not afford the rent yourself, so you moved out as well. Therefore, the lease was broken, and since it was his fault, it should be his responsibility.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Judge Judy continues in a moment.
What do you need to...
Robert and Charlotte Brett say former roommate Taylor Nichols broke their lease when he abruptly moved out.
How many bedrooms were in this house?
3.
Well, it was you and your girlfriend. Did you share a room?
Yes, ma'am.
And the defendant had a room. Who was the other roommate?
There was no other roommate.
So there was a spare room?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that what you're telling me? There was a spare room. And what kind of house was it?
It was an apartment complex.
Would you tell me what efforts you made to find another roommate?
There were not many efforts made.
Why not?
Because originally we were going to get an apartment by ourselves. But with Taylor being a close friend to both of us, we decided that we'd include him, but since we were going to be getting married soon, we didn't want to take on any other roommate that we weren't familiar with or comfortable with.
You have a little problem. Do you understand what your problem is? You have to do something to mitigate your damages, not just move out. Now, what was your rent, sir, in this apartment?
I want to say $1,100 a month.
Your share or the entire rent?
The entire thing was $1,100. My share was $500, I believe.
You have a lease?
I don't.
I'd like to see the lease.
Unfortunately, ma'am, we weren't able to find one.
Well, what proof did you bring?
I have the statement from the credit company.
That doesn't help me at all.
I also have just the statement that the credit company had been paid in regards to the
That doesn't help me at all. That just means you paid a bill. I have to see a lease that has your name and your name and your name, and make sure there wasn't another person's name on the lease, and what the rent was, and when it started, and when it was terminated, and your ability to have other tenants in the apartment. I have to see all that. It's an apartment complex. Did you go to the apartment complex?
Yes, ma'am.
And?
It's changed management several times, and they made it very difficult for us to obtain, since we lived with the community before they took over.
Where are you currently living?
In Duluth, in a different apartment.
How much are you paying in rent?
$869 a month.
So a couple of $100 less than the entire rent on this apartment. So you could have very easily had somebody else move into that apartment, because now you have 2 spare rooms.
Yes, ma'am.
What month did you move back to your parents' house?
January 2012.
How long had you lived together in the apartment?
5 months, 6 months.
In the 5 to 6 months that you lived there, did you pay your rent regularly?
Yes, ma'am.
And there was never any problem, because I don't see that there was ever any problem here. So half the lease was already done.
Close to it.
So it would have meant sort of extending yourself another 6 months. When you sign a lease, you usually have security deposit. Did you all put in security deposit?
I believe it was a relatively small security deposit, $300.
It's hard to tell because I don't have a lease.
Yes, ma'am.
Judge Judy continues in a moment. Real cases, real people. Judge Judy. Robert and Charlotte Brett say former roommate Taylor Nichols broke their lease when he abruptly moved out.
A, you have no lease. B, you lived in several places since. C, you made no effort to try to sublet at least one of those rooms, which would have given you at least $200, which would have covered the same rent as you're paying now. Just the two of you.
She and I were very adamant on having our own place together.
Then you shouldn't have taken on a third roommate.
Yes, ma'am. We made a very special exception for somebody that was very close to us.
Whenever you take on the responsibility of another person, you take on the responsibility of another person, warts and all. That's why you should have been very happy to live in a smaller place, just the two of you. What did you need a spare room for?
So that the men could